Welcome to Reformed Thinking. When you look at an x-ray of a broken bone, you expect a certain level of cold, hard reality.
Right, yeah. There's no hiding the damage.
Well, precisely. Like a simple hairline fracture might just require a splint and some rest. But imagine you are looking at an x-ray of a severe convoluted fracture where the bone is shattered into multiple pieces.
Yeah, that is a serious catastrophic situation.
It is. And the doctor does not point at that image and say, well, we have a few aesthetic choices here. Maybe we just wrap it in a bandage and think positive thoughts.
Absolutely not. The physical reality of the damage dictates a very specific, highly invasive mechanical intervention.
Right. The surgeon has to go in with pins and plates because the mechanics of the break require a precise mechanical fix.
There are no alternate routes there. The reality demands a specific response.
And today we are initiating a deep dive into a theological text that approaches the concept of human sin and divine forgiveness with that very same level of surgical, unyielding precision.
That analogy is absolutely spot on for what we are looking at today. Because, we are so accustomed to treating spiritual matters as ethereal or emotional or just highly subjective.
Yeah, we want forgiveness to be a feeling, like a simple wave of the hand from the heavens.
Right, a blank check. But the source material we're investigating today operates on the premise that the universe has an immovable moral architecture.
We are looking at an excerpt from Chapter 7 of John Owen's monumental work, A Dissertation on Divine Justice. And for those who might not be familiar with the landscape of 17th century Puritan theology, John Owen is a titan.
Oh, absolutely, a massive figure.
He was writing from the perspective of Protestant Christianity, strictly adhering to Reformed theology and the framework of the Westminster Confession. And our specific mission in this deep dive is to understand Owen's argument for the absolute, categorical necessity of God punishing sin.
Yeah, we are going to analyze why the death of Jesus Christ on the cross was not just a tragic option or a beautiful, sentimental gesture of solidarity with human suffering.
Right. It was a strict, undeniable, and legally binding divine necessity.
And it is a massive undertaking, really, because Owen is pushing against a very natural human assumption. He writes with the precise syllogistic logic of a 17th century academic.
He really builds his arguments like a master stonemason constructing a fortress wall, doesn't he?
He does, stone by stone, premise by premise, just making sure no enemy fire can break through. He is methodically dismantling the idea that God could forgive sin without a substitute taking the penalty.
Right. And to frame this entire conversation, I want you, the listener, to put yourself in a hypothetical scenario. It is a question you have probably heard or maybe even asked yourself at some point.
It is a very common objection.
It is. If God is perfectly loving, omniscient, and possesses absolute capability over the entire universe, why could he not just look down at humanity, see our rebellion, and say, I forgive you?
Just wave it all away.
Yeah, why not just cancel the debt with a word? Why did there have to be blood? Why the horror and the brutality of the cross? That question, that tension between infinite love and infinite justice is the central nerve we are going to dissect.
And that hypothetical scenario is perhaps the single most common objection raised against the Christian gospel. It sounds so reasonable to the modern ear.
It does. It makes logical sense on the surface.
Right, because if I can forgive someone who wrongs me without requiring them to bleed, why cannot the creator of the universe do the same? Surely he is more magnanimous than I am.
That is the thought process, yeah.
But John Owen tackles this objection by looking at the very nature of who God is. He argues from the essential attributes of the creator, proving that bypassing justice is a logical and moral impossibility.
So it is not that God lacks the desire to be merciful.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
It is rather that his essential nature forbids him from acting unjustly.
Let's break down the first major argument Owen presents in our text. He labels it as Argument 3 in this specific chapter, and he frames it as a classic syllogism concerning the glory of God.
And for anyone who might have skipped formal logic in college, a syllogism is a structured argument containing a major proposition, a minor proposition, and a conclusion.
And that conclusion unavoidably follows if the first two premises are true, right?
Spot on.
Yes. So Owen's major proposition is this: God must preserve his glory entire to all eternity. He argues this is a necessity of God's nature because God cannot but love himself.
He actually cites the book of Isaiah, chapter 42, verse 8, where God explicitly declares, I am the Lord, that is my name, and my glory will I not give to another.
It is crucial to pause here, I think, and define what Owen means by glory, because in our modern vocabulary, we often equate glory with fame or applause or public recognition.
Yeah, we think of a glorious athlete or a glorious military victory, something very external and fleeting.
But in Reformed theology, God's glory is not some fragile ego project. The Hebrew concept of glory implies weight or substance. God's glory is the visible manifestation of his infinite perfections.
Right. It is the objective reality of his supreme worth. When Owen says God must preserve his glory, he means God must act in perfect consistency with his own supreme reality.
And that leads directly into his minor proposition, which is the assumption driving the argument. If sin exists, God cannot preserve his glory free from violation without punishing that sin.
And so the conclusion drops like an anvil on the reader.
God must punish sin. If he does not, his glory is violated. He ceases to be perfectly consistent with his own nature.
It is a brilliant, inescapable structure. It really corners the reader. Because if you accept the biblical premise that God is fundamentally committed to his own perfect reality, you have to accept the conclusion.
What is fascinating is how Owen breaks down this concept of glory into three distinct pillars that are directly assaulted by human sin.
Yes, those three pillars are justice, holiness, and dominion. If any one of these three is compromised, God's glory is shattered.
I am really hung up on that first pillar, justice. Because normally, in our human interactions, if someone wrongs me and I just let it go without demanding restitution, society views me as the bigger person.
Yeah, you are seen as gracious, magnanimous.
But Owen relies on some incredibly heavy scriptural backing to say that if God does that, it is actually a catastrophic failure. He quotes the book of Proverbs, chapter 17, verse 15.
That is a stark verse.
It really is. It states, "He that justifieth the wicked, and he that condemneth the just, even they both are abomination to the Lord."
That verse is a stumbling block for a lot of people who want a purely accommodating deity. Owen is taking that proverb to its logical zenith.
He is saying that for God to omit justice, to simply let a guilty, rebellious creature walk free without the penalty being paid, impairs his glory just as much as if God were to actively commit a malicious injustice.
And we naturally understand that condemning an innocent person is wicked. We all agree on that. But the Bible says justifying the wicked is equally an abomination.
We also see a reference to Genesis chapter 18, verse 25, where Abraham asks, "Shall not the judge of all the earth do right?"
Right. Owen is essentially arguing that a judge who lets a murderer walk free out of sheer sentimentality is not a good judge. He's a corrupt judge.
Yeah, we require our human judges to uphold the law, regardless of their personal feelings toward the defendant.
Imagine if a judge's son is murdered, and the murderer stands before him in court. The judge says, well, I am a loving person, so I'm just going to let you go.
The entire courtroom would erupt in outrage. The victim's blood cries out for justice.
Precisely. If God simply waves away sin, he ceases to be just. His justice is not a hat he wears when he feels like being strict. It is his very essence.
So if he acts against his essence, he ceases to be God, declaring those who are worthy of death to be completely clear of guilt without any penalty being paid obliterates the glory of his justice.
That brings us to the second pillar Owen identifies, which is holiness. You brought up the idea of his essence, and holiness is absolutely central to that in the Westminster framework.
Owen quotes the book of Habakkuk, chapter 1, verse 13, pointing out that God is of purer eyes than to behold evil and cannot look on iniquity.
He also brings in Joshua chapter 24, verse 19, where Joshua issues a terrifying warning to the Israelites.
Oh, I remember that one. He tells them, "Ye cannot serve the Lord, for he is an holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions nor your sins."
Which does not mean God lacks the capacity for salvation, but it means he will not simply overlook rebellion. Holiness is a concept we have severely watered down in modern times.
We really have. We often think of it as just being exceptionally nice or morally upright.
But biblical holiness is an active, burning repulsion of anything contrary to God's perfect nature. Think of a sterile operating room.
Okay, an operating room.
If someone walks in covered in mud and bacteria, the sterility of the room is compromised. The mud has to be expelled. Sin is not just a minor infraction or a mistake.
It is a defilement, a corruption.
Yeah, a spiritual contagion. God's holiness means he cannot coexist with this contagion.
I am thinking about the imagery of the New Jerusalem in the book of Revelation, chapter 21, verse 27. It explicitly states that nothing defiled or anyone who does what is detestable or false will ever enter it.
There is this massive, unbridgeable gap between absolute purity and the pollution of sin.
And the church has to be washed by Christ, as Ephesians chapter 5 describes, because, well, as Hebrews chapter 9 lays down as a bedrock rule, without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sins.
The shedding of blood in the biblical context represents life poured out in judgment to cleanse that defilement. It is a visceral, severe mechanism.
So without that vicarious punishment, without a substitute absorbing the wrath and cleansing the stain, the pollution remains.
And a holy God must banish it from his presence. He cannot invite contamination into the throne room of the universe.
Which brings us to the third pillar of God's glory that Owen highlights, and that is dominion. This one feels very political, almost like a discussion of medieval kingship.
It does. Sin is described as a renunciation of God's natural dominion over rational creatures. It is high treason.
It is the creature looking at the Creator, the one who sustains their very breath, and saying, I will not be ruled by you. I will be my own God.
And Owen argues that this broken dominion can only be restored through vicarious punishment. Treason requires a response, or else the sovereign's authority is entirely voided.
If a king ignores an open rebellion in his provinces, he's effectively abdicating his throne.
Exactly.
But I understand the logic, I do. I want to push back on Owen's framework here for a moment, though. Does this necessity make God sound constrained by his own rules?
How so?
Think of a human king who constantly demands his own glory, who demands people bow to him, and refuses to forgive anyone who slights his dominion without severe punishment. We would call that king vain, petty, insecure, and tyrannical.
We certainly would.
So how is God's relentless demand for his own glory and his refusal to let slights to his dominion go unpunished different from human vanity?
That is an incredibly perceptive question, and it is a trap many philosophers and skeptics fall into when trying to understand God's motives.
Because it sounds so similar on the surface.
It does, but we constantly project our fallen, fragmented human psychology onto the Creator. When a human king demands glory, he is demanding something he does not inherently possess by his own nature.
Right. He is a creature seeking validation from other creatures.
Yes, it is vanity because it is an illusion of supremacy. He bleeds and dies just like the peasants.
He's trying to fill a void.
Absolutely. But God is the objective, supreme perfection of all reality. His nature is the actual standard of truth, goodness, and beauty.
So it is a completely different category.
Entirely. For God to love his own glory is for him to love what is objectively the highest good in existence. If God were to value anything above himself or prioritize the comfort of rebellious creatures over his own perfect justice, he would be committing idolatry.
Oh, wow. Because he would be valuing a lesser thing over the supreme thing.
Right. Therefore, his dedication to his own glory is not vanity. It is the ultimate expression of truth. He is not constrained by external rules. He is acting in perfect consistency with his own infinite perfection.
That distinction changes everything. It is the difference between an insecure actor demanding applause from an audience and the sun simply radiating heat and light, because that is the fundamental reality of what a star is.
That is a great way to put it. The sun does not shine to boost its ego. It shines because to do anything else would mean it ceases to be a star.
But this reality that God's justice, holiness, and dominion mathematically and legally require the punishment of sin creates a massive, seemingly insurmountable problem for humanity.
It really does.
It means every single one of us is on death row, and the judge cannot legally just open the cell doors and let us out.
Which brings us to the opposing views of Owen's day, because he was not writing this dissertation in a vacuum. He was actively battling theological movements that wanted to soften this reality.
Specifically regarding this idea of easy, consequence-free forgiveness.
Yes, Owen addresses his adversaries head-on. He identifies them primarily as the Socinians.
For our listeners who might not be up on 16th and 17th century theological controversies, who were the Socinians and what were they arguing?
The Socinian movement was a highly rationalist theological branch named after Fausto Socini. They were precursors to modern Unitarianism.
Okay, so they leaned heavily on human reason.
Very much so. They denied several Orthodox Christian doctrines, including the Trinity, but highly relevant to our discussion, they vehemently denied the necessity of penal substitutionary atonement.
Ah. Their position was essentially what you described in your opening hypothetical scenario, right? They believed that God, by a simple nod or word, could freely pardon sin without any satisfaction made.
They thought God could just snap his fingers and make the dead disappear. They argued that God could do this without diminishing his glory, simply because he is the supreme ruler and can do whatever he wants with his own laws.
So they viewed God more as an offended private individual who can choose to drop a lawsuit, rather than the moral bedrock of the universe whose nature demands justice.
Exactly. And Owen's response to this is dripping with a very specific, biting kind of 17th century academic sarcasm.
It is quite funny to read, actually. He employs this rhetorical, sarcastic humility. He calls himself dull and claims he lacks the quick-sighted ingenuity of his intellectual opponent.
He essentially says, I must be really slow. My brain must just not work as well as yours, because I cannot fathom how, if you guys are right, Jesus Christ did not just die for absolutely nothing.
It is a devastating critique, cloaked in false modesty.
It really is. Owen is highlighting a massive, gaping logical crater in the Socinian argument. If God could easily forgive sin with a simple word, a mere nod from heaven, why would a merciful Father subject his own perfectly innocent, holy Son to the cross?
And remember, as Owen notes in the text, Christ was introduced into the world in a preternatural manner.
Let's clarify that term, preternatural, because it sounds like something out of a ghost story to modern ears.
It does. What does Owen mean by that in this context?
In theological terms, preternatural means something that exists or occurs outside the normal course of nature. Owen is referring to the virgin birth.
Okay, so Christ was conceived by the Holy Spirit, bypassing the natural generation of human beings.
Yes. The significance of this in Reformed theology is that Christ did not inherit the stain of original sin that is passed down from Adam. He was entirely pure. He lived a life of absolute perfection, actively fulfilling the law and pointing people to the way of life.
So Owen is asking, why would God take this completely flawless being, this preternaturally pure son, and subject him to intense afflictions, unspeakable suffering, and finally a cruel, ignominious, and accursed death, if there was literally any other way to accomplish the goal?
It makes no sense. The Socinian view, in an attempt to make God seem more merciful and loving by removing the rigid requirement of justice, actually turns the crucifixion into a display of cosmic horror.
Let's ground this in a modern legal analogy, because I think it highlights just how bizarre and disturbing the Socinian view makes God look.
Please do.
Imagine a human judge presiding over a courtroom. A convicted criminal is standing before him. The judge has the absolute legal authority to issue a full pardon.
It requires zero effort.
Right. He just needs to sign a piece of paper on his desk and the criminal goes free. But instead of just signing the paper, the judge sends bailiffs to drag his own innocent, law-abiding son into the courtroom.
Oh, this is dark.
The judge then brutally executes his own son in front of everyone, claims it is to make a point or show how serious the law is, and then turns to the criminal and says, okay, now you are pardoned.
If we saw a judge do that, we would not call him merciful. We would call him a psychopath.
It is gratuitous, senseless violence. If the pardon could have been issued with a pen stroke, the death of the son is an atrocity.
And that is Owen's point. The Reformed view, which Owen is fiercely defending, presents the cross as an absolute legal and moral necessity. God did not crush his son to make a theatrical point.
He crushed his son because the full weight of divine justice had to fall somewhere. The ledger of the universe had to be balanced. Sin had to be punished.
Owen backs this up by reading the scriptural proofs regarding God's hatred of sin. He lists verses showing God is a consuming fire, an everlasting burning, and that he will by no means clear the guilty.
The cross is the only place in the cosmos where that consuming fire of divine wrath could burn itself out on a worthy substitute, thereby allowing true mercy to flow to the guilty without violating justice.
So, if there is no substitute, there remains nothing but a fearful looking for of judgment. That makes the stakes of this theological debate incredibly high.
We are not just debating how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. We are debating the very character of God and the entire meaning of the cross.
Yes, the core of the faith.
But as we analyze this, there is a seemingly massive biblical contradiction to Owen's view that we have to address. It is an objection that comes from the very mouth of Jesus himself.
Ah, the Gethsemane objection.
Yes. In the Garden of Gethsemane, sweating drops of blood in sheer agony, Christ prays, Abba, Father, all things are possible unto thee. Take away this cup from me.
He explicitly says all things are possible.
So if Jesus himself, the Son of God, says all things are possible for the Father, does that not mean another way of salvation was, in fact, possible? How does Owen reconcile his strict necessity with Christ's own prayer?
This is one of the most poignant and intellectually challenging objections Owen faces, and he handles it with tremendous philosophical care.
He really parses the language.
He introduces a crucial theological distinction regarding the word impossibility and the scope of God's capability. We have to understand the difference between what Owen calls absolute impossibility and conditional impossibility.
This distinction is fascinating. Let's really break those down for the listeners so we can grasp the mechanics of what was happening in the garden. What is absolute impossibility?
Absolute impossibility respects the absolute capability of God antecedent to any free act of his will.
Okay, so before he decides to do anything specific.
Think of it as God's sheer might in a vacuum, before he makes any decrees or promises. In this absolute sense, God has the capability to do anything that does not contradict his essential nature.
Like, he has the absolute capability to create a million new galaxies right now.
Right, and regarding humanity, he had the absolute capability to simply leave the entire human race to perish in their sins. He was not obligated by anything external to save anyone.
So in that absolute vacuum state, it was not strictly impossible for the cup of suffering to pass from Christ, because God could have simply chosen to execute pure justice on humanity and let us fall into eternal ruin.
Spot on. So Jesus is acknowledging the sheer unbridled sovereignty of the Father.
Yeah.
He is saying, you are God. You have the capability to stop this and just judge the world.
But that absolute vacuum is not the reality we live in, because God did make a decree. And that brings us to conditional impossibility.
Yes, conditional impossibility respects God's capability as directed by a determined order of his will. God had already freely willed, decreed, and promised from eternity past to pardon sinners and bring a people to himself.
He established a covenant.
Once that decree was established, the condition was set in stone. Given the condition that God was going to save fallen, rebellious humans, it became absolutely impossible to do so without laying the punishment on the surety, Jesus Christ.
His unyielding justice and perfect holiness demanded it.
So when Jesus says all things are possible, he is speaking to the absolute capability of God in a vacuum. But the Father's silence in response to that agonizing prayer speaks to the conditional impossibility.
The decree of salvation had been made. There was no other mechanical way to fulfill that decree without God violating his own nature.
This completely reframes the agony in the garden. It takes it from a scene of mere physical dread to a scene of staggering cosmic weight.
It really does. I want to talk about the immense weight of this distinction for believers operating within the Reformed tradition. This enhances the gravity of the atonement in a way that is hard to articulate.
It anchors everything.
Christ was not asking for an alternate plan that God just denied because the cross would make a better story for future generations to read about. Christ was facing the immovable reality of God's conditional will.
He was staring down the barrel of infinite divine justice, knowing that because God loved his people and had decreed to save them, the Son had to be crushed.
There was no plan B. The cup could not pass.
It proves that God's love is not a cheap sentiment. It is not a greeting card. It is a love that willingly subjects itself to the inflexible demands of divine justice.
When you understand that the cross was a mathematical and legal necessity for your salvation, your gratitude changes. You realize the immense, unfathomable cost of the pardon you have received.
Having secured the necessity of the cross against that major biblical objection, Owen shifts gears. He moves into a series of rapid-fire logical proofs to reinforce his stance.
He appends several shorter arguments to the main text, and we are going to walk through the first three right now.
These appended arguments are fascinating because they show how Owen builds his case, not just from direct biblical proof texts, but from the deep philosophical implications of who God is.
He is using the tools of classical philosophy to defend biblical orthodoxy. His first argument here deals with the concepts of habit and act.
Yes, he states that a second act presupposes a first, and a constant manner of operating proves a habit.
If we see God constantly doing good to all, we logically conclude he is good. If God constantly judges righteously, as the book of Psalms, chapter 119, verse 137 declares, "Righteous art thou, O Lord, and upright are thy judgments," then punitory justice must be essentially inherent in him.
It is not an arbitrary reaction. It is a fixed attribute. But we really need to unpack what 17th century thinkers meant by the word habit, because it means something very different to us today.
Oh, for sure. Today, a habit is biting your nails or drinking coffee at 7 in the morning. It is a behavior you picked up.
But in the Aristotelian and scholastic philosophical tradition that Owen was educated in, a habit, or habitus, is an intrinsic, ingrained disposition. It is a fundamental property of character that dictates how a being will necessarily act.
So it is an essential quality, not a learned behavior.
Yes. The logic here is straightforward. You know a tree by its fruit. A constant, uniform course of just operation in punishing sin throughout the biblical narrative proves that this justice is not an acquired trait or a temporary policy God enacted for a specific era.
It is woven into the very fabric of the divine nature. From his law, which is the visible sign of the divine will, we see the reality of what he is.
Just as we know God is the living God because he constantly gives life, we know he is a fundamentally just judge because he constantly punishes sin.
That flows naturally into his second rapid-fire argument, the concept of nature as law. Owen addresses an objection someone might raise.
A skeptic might say, well, a human judge has to punish crime because he is bound by the laws of the state. He has a rule book he has to follow.
But God is sovereign. He is not subject to any external law. He doesn't have a constitution he has to answer to, so why cannot he just forgive?
And Owen's response to that is philosophically bulletproof. He agrees entirely that God is not subject to an external law. There is no higher authority telling God what to do.
But he counters by asserting that God's very nature is a law unto itself.
Meaning he is the rule book. He cannot lie. Not because there is a universal rule against lying out there in the ether that God has to obey, but because he himself is truth.
The law against lying emanates directly from his character.
Similarly, he cannot let the wicked pass unpunished, not because a higher court demands it, but because he is inherently a just judge. Such as God is by nature, such is he in the acts of his will.
His will can never, ever contradict his nature. It is the ultimate consistency. He cannot act against himself.
Then we hit the third argument in this rapid-fire section, and it deals with what Owen calls the immutable difference of things.
This gets into some really heavy philosophical territory. He argues that sin destroys the subjection of the creature to the Creator.
And even God's absolute capability cannot make sin not sin, because hating the supreme good implies a logical contradiction.
To fully grasp this, we have to look at the nature of sin itself. Sin is not just breaking an arbitrary rule, like going 65 in a 55-mile-per-hour zone.
It is an assault on reality. God is the supreme good. For a creature to hate, ignore, or rebel against the supreme good is inherently evil.
God's omnipotence means he can do all things that are logically possible and consistent with his nature. It does not mean he can do the absurd.
He cannot make a square circle. He cannot make a rock so heavy he cannot lift it. And he cannot make rebellion against the supreme good a virtuous or acceptable thing.
Think of it like mathematics. I love using this analogy. Just as God cannot decree that 2 + 2 = 5, because that contradicts the fundamental reality of numbers and logic, God cannot decree that high treason against his throne is suddenly acceptable.
He cannot look at humanity's active hatred of the supreme good and declare it to be mathematically or morally neutral. It contradicts the reality of who he is.
If, from the very nature of the thing, sin is sin in relation to the supreme perfection of God, then from the nature of the thing, its punishment is also inherently required.
God ordered children to obey their parents because it is inherently right based on the natural order. He punishes sin because it is inherently right to do so based on the moral order.
It is not an arbitrary choice. The moral universe has physics, just as the physical universe does.
These logical proofs are airtight, and they expose a glaring hypocrisy in the arguments of the adversaries, which lead us naturally into looking at arguments 4 and 5 from Owen's list.
Here, he sets up some brilliant theological traps that corner his opponents.
Let's examine argument 4, which we can call the impenitence paradox. Owen notes a major concession from his adversaries.
Even the Socinians, who want to say God can forgive without a substitute, admit that God cannot save the obstinately wicked without injury to his holiness.
They acknowledge that if someone completely refuses to repent and actively curses God until their dying breath, God's justice will not suffer them to be saved. They agree that the unrepentant must be punished.
And here is where Owen springs the trap, and it is a thing of beauty. He asks, what kind of justice is it that regards the mode or the circumstance of the sin, in this case the obstinate impenitence, but does not regard the sin itself?
If justice requires the punishment of the unrepentant sinner, it means justice inherently demands the punishment of the sin. You cannot say justice demands punishment only if the person refuses to apologize.
It is a devastating point. Think about our human justice system again. A bank robber gets caught. If he goes to court, cries, and says he is truly sorry, the judge might give him a lighter sentence. But the judge does not just say, oh, you apologized, the crime never happened, go home.
The crime itself requires satisfaction, regardless of the criminal's later feelings about it. It shows the massive inconsistency of trying to soften God's justice.
If sin in itself does not demand punishment, then God could just as easily forgive the obstinately wicked as the penitent. If he can wave away the debt with a word, he can wave away the obstinacy too.
The fact that even the adversaries agree the obstinate must be punished proves that justice is a necessary active force responding to the reality of sin.
Which brings us to argument 5. And this is a massive theological dilemma, perhaps the weightiest point in this entire section. We can call it the cause of ruin.
Owen says that God punishes sin either because he simply wills it arbitrarily or because it is inherently just that sin should be punished.
Let's trace the implications of that first option because it is terrifying. If God punishes sin simply because he arbitrarily wills it, meaning there is nothing in his essential nature that demands it, he just decides to punish it out of pure volition, then the will of God becomes the singular, isolated cause of a sinner's perdition.
And that blatantly contradicts Scripture. Owen points to the book of Hosea, chapter 13, verse 9, where God says, "O Israel, thou hast destroyed thyself, but in me is thine help."
God places the blame for ruin squarely on the creature's rebellion. The creature destroyed itself.
But if God could have easily forgiven without violating his justice and just chose not to, then God's arbitrary choice is the real reason for their destruction.
If the non-punishment of sin is entirely possible, and nothing in God's nature demands punishment, then a free pardon would seem much more agreeable to God's grace, love, and compassion.
If he could just wave it away without violating his justice, why would he not do that for every single person?
If he punishes people when he could have just easily forgiven them, it paints a horrifying picture of God.
It does. It means the only reason hell exists is because God simply felt like creating a torture chamber, not because moral reality demanded a place of separation for those who rebel against the source of life.
If God's bare will is the only factor, and there is no inherent evil in sin that demands a reaction from a holy God, then hell is an act of cosmic tyranny.
That is a chilling thought. If the transgression of the law deserves punishment only because God arbitrarily wills it so, and the condition of reality requires no such thing, then why should we even hate sin?
Sin becomes just a technicality. It is like jaywalking.
But Owen concludes this section with a thunderous defense of orthodoxy. If God punishes sin because, by virtue of his natural justice, it is just that it should be punished, then it is unjust not to punish it.
And as Paul asks rhetorically in Romans, is God unjust? God forbid.
It all circles back to the absolute integrity of God's character. If it is just to punish sin, omitting that punishment is a miscarriage of justice.
This is why these philosophical debates we are analyzing are not just academic exercises reserved for dusty libraries or ivory towers. Getting this wrong leads to disastrous consequences for a believer's faith.
If you believe God could have forgiven you without the cross, your entire relationship with God and your understanding of what he saved you from completely changes.
And that is precisely where Owen directs his fiery conclusion. He addresses the extreme danger of believing there were other ways to achieve salvation. He expresses intense frustration with theologians who compromise on this.
And he specifically calls out Augustine here, which shows Owen is not afraid to challenge the absolute giants of church history.
That is a big deal for a Puritan to criticize Augustine, since the Reformers generally loved him.
It is a huge deal. He is frustrated with divines who taught that God could have saved humanity by other means, but that the way of the blood of his son was just more proper and becoming.
Owen actually states that he is ashamed of these theologians. That is incredibly strong language.
He argues that this idea of God possessing an absolute capability to forgive without a sacrifice has not a single syllable of support in the entirety of the sacred writings. It is a theological invention.
Why do you think theologians like Augustine even proposed it?
It was likely designed to protect a certain philosophical view of God's total freedom. They wanted to emphasize that God is not bound by anything, so they claimed he could have saved us another way to prove his sovereignty.
But as Owen points out, protecting a philosophical concept of freedom ends up destroying the very basis of the gospel narrative.
I want you, the listener, to really consider Owen's warning here. He says a more convenient device to weaken our faith, love, and gratitude cannot be invented.
Think about the psychological impact of this. If the cross was just a choice among many, if God had a menu of options for saving you, and he just picked the crucifixion because it was the most dramatic or fitting for the time period, it cheapens the mystery of God's love.
It turns the cross into a theater production rather than a cosmic rescue mission where the rescuer had to die to save the victim.
It undermines the necessity of the incarnation itself. Why would the infinite word become flesh?
Why would the infinite God confine himself to a human nature, experience hunger, thirst, betrayal, the lash of the whip, and the terrifying wrath of his own father if he could have accomplished the exact same result with a word from heaven.
If you teach that the mystery of the love of the Father, the blood of the Son, and the grace of the Spirit were not strictly mechanically necessary for procuring salvation, you drain the gospel of its vitality.
Owen brings in his final crushing points by looking at the entire structure of the Old Testament. He asks a very practical question. Why did God institute so many expiatory sacrifices in the nation of Israel?
And let's define expiatory. It means a sacrifice that takes away guilt through the payment of a penalty. Why the constant shedding of animal blood?
Why the massive labor, the incredible cost to the Israelites, and the severe punishments for performing the rituals wrong?
If you read the book of Leviticus, the sacrificial system was visceral, exhausting, and bloody. Hebrews chapter 10 tells us the blood of bulls and goats could never actually take away sin.
They were pointers. They were massive, bloody signs screaming that a necessary, perfect sacrifice was coming.
If God could just forgive with a word, the entire Old Testament tabernacle system was a pointless, gruesome charade.
Furthermore, Owen points to the prophetic reality of Isaiah chapter 53, verse 10. That verse says, "Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him, he hath put him to grief, when thou shalt make his soul an offering for sin."
Why would Jehovah awaken his sword against his own son? Why would he forsake him on the cross, prompting Jesus to cry out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?"
If there was no necessary cause, if justice did not absolutely demand it, then God's actions in bruising his son become entirely incomprehensible.
They become the actions of a capricious, unstable deity, not the loving, just God of the Bible.
It is an incredibly sobering reality to face, and it demands a response from the believer.
We are arriving at the end of our deep dive, and we need to synthesize what we have uncovered in this massive, dense text. The core thesis that John Owen has so meticulously proven is this: for God to remain God, to preserve his glory entire, to maintain his perfect justice, his unapproachable holiness, and his sovereign dominion over creation sin absolutely, unequivocally had to be punished.
The cross of Jesus Christ was not an arbitrary option picked from a hat. It was the sole arena in the cosmos where God's infinite, unyielding grace could intersect with his immovable, terrifying justice.
When a believer grasps the absolute necessity of the atonement, it fundamentally alters their worship. It completely removes the modern, palatable idea of a casual, sentimental waving away of sin.
It grounds your salvation in an ironclad legal and moral reality. Your debt was not just canceled, it was paid in full, with blood.
When you sing of the cross on a Sunday morning, you are not singing about a tragic accident or a mere demonstration of empathy. You are singing about the only possible mechanism by which a holy God could bring a defiled rebel into his presence without destroying them.
That jagged white line on the X-ray we talked about at the beginning, it is there. The diagnosis of humanity is total depravity and total liability to divine justice.
But the cure is equally precise, equally specific, and entirely sufficient. I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over as you go about your day. We have established that the punishment of sin is mathematically and logically required by the very nature of God.
Consider what that means for our own concept of mercy.
Does true mercy require someone to absorb the blow, rather than just pretending the offense never happened? Think about the debts you owe others and the debts owed to you.
Ask yourself what true satisfaction actually requires in those relationships.
It might just change how you forgive, knowing how you were forgiven.
A weighty question to consider.
Thank you for joining us for this extensive theological examination. Keep analyzing the texts, keep seeking the truth, and keep your mind anchored in the realities of the faith.